Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a high-stakes debate in Singapore that revolves around a single, controversial IVF technology. It promises parents a healthier baby, but the science? Well, the science is really shaky. This is the story of a clash between cutting-edge tech, deep-seated cultural beliefs, and the very personal dream of having a family.
So let's start with the question at the very heart of all this. Imagine you're going through the emotional and financial roller coaster of IVF. What if you could get a kind of guarantee? A test to make sure the embryo you're about to implant is healthy. That idea is incredibly powerful, almost impossible to turn down, right? It promises a little bit of certainty in a process that has none.
And the technology that makes that promise is called pre-implantation genetic testing, or PGT-A for short. The idea is simple. You screen the embryos for any genetic problems before they're even transferred. On paper, it sounds like the perfect insurance policy for one of the biggest investments of your life.
So what exactly is this insurance policy supposed to be protecting you from? Well, at its core, PGT-A is all about managing risk, avoiding heartbreak, and hopefully delivering a much happier outcome.
And the way it's often sold to patients by fertility clinics is super compelling. They basically say, look, spend some extra money now on this test, and you can weed out the abnormal embryos. You can avoid the future pain of a miscarriage, or the trauma of having to consider a later-stage abortion, or raising a child with a condition like Down syndrome.
But here's the twist. Despite that powerful promise, the Singaporean government has pretty much hit the brakes hard. The Ministry of Health hasn't approved PGT-A for mainstream use. Instead, it's stuck in this very restricted, tightly controlled pilot trial, which signals some pretty deep skepticism from the top.
And when you look at the results from that government trial, well, the picture gets stark. Out of almost 600 patients who signed up hoping for a better shot, the whole process ended with just 56 live births. That's a success rate of less than 10% from the starting group. Citing this huge drop-off, the government called the results inconclusive, which is basically a polite way of saying the test really didn't prove it was worth it.
Now, Singapore's hesitation isn't happening in a bubble. It's actually a reflection of this massive global debate, where for years, the scientific community has been raising some major red flags about whether PGT-A actually works.
I mean, just take a look at this. This is from the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, one of the biggest authorities in the world. They state, pretty bluntly, that its broad use cannot be recommended because the results are so doubtful. That's not just cautious language. That's a serious warning.
And the evidence against it is coming from all over. The UK's health authority gave it a red light. Big important clinical trials, they found it made no real difference in live birth rates. And get this, one huge database analysis even suggested that for women under 35, using PGT-A was actually linked to a lower chance of having a baby. Just wow.
So you know what happens when the science gets this shaky, right? The lawyers get involved. In the United States, the companies that make these tests are facing class action lawsuits, and the claims are simple. You sold us a product that is inaccurate, unproven, and totally misleading.
The consequences of these tests being wrong can be absolutely devastating. In Australia, one fertility company had to pay out $56 million because its testing led to the destruction of hundreds of healthy embryos. Just think about that for a second. For those families, the test didn't just fail to help. It might have destroyed their one and only chance to ever have a child.
Okay, so this brings us right back to Singapore and the central question of this whole story. With all this scientific doubt, these international red lights and massive lawsuits, why on earth would Singapore even be thinking about approving PGT-A?
The answer, it turns out, isn't really in the science at all. It's in Singapore's unique social landscape. The country's fertility rate has cratered to an all-time low. And when families are having maybe one or at most two children, the pressure for that child to be, well, perfect, or at least perfectly healthy, becomes enormous.
And what's compounding this is that women are starting families later in life. Singapore's women are highly educated, they're focused on their careers, and they're keenly aware that the risk of chromosomal problems like Down syndrome goes up with age. So this creates a really strong desire for any tool that seems to mitigate that risk.
Another really powerful factor here is faith. Singapore is a very religious society, and for many people, abortion is simply not an option they would ever consider. So, PGT-A presents itself as a kind of ethical workaround, a way to screen embryos beforehand so a family never has to face that agonizing choice later on.
And then, layered right on top of all of this is a deep-seated cultural stigma.
In a society with strong Confucian roots, having a child with a condition like Down syndrome can be seen as more than just a medical challenge. It can be viewed as a source of shame for the family. The pressure to avoid that outcome at almost any cost is just immense.
So you see the paradox, right? The science is saying PGT-A is doubtful, but the culture is practically demanding the solution it claims to offer. So how can policymakers possibly thread that needle? Well, there's a proposed path forward that offers a really surprising solution.
The main recommendation is a complete rebrand. Just stop marketing PGT-A as a therapeutic procedure. That's going to boost your chances of having a baby because the evidence just doesn't back that up. Instead, let's officially classify it as what it is, a risky diagnostic tool, kind of like amniocentesis, that's used purely for screening, not for treatment.
And this new framing creates a 4-step path to approval. Step 1, go ahead and allow it, respecting that patients should have a choice. But then you add 3 crucial guardrails. You reclassify it. You mandate rigorous, honest counseling about all the risks. And finally, you regulate how clinics can advertise it to get rid of all the false promises. And this mandatory counseling would have to be brutally honest. We're talking about telling patients that so-called mosaic embryos, which have a mix of cells, can often self-correct and lead to a perfectly healthy baby, meaning that by discarding them, you could actually be lowering your chances of getting pregnant. You'd have to warn them that the biopsy itself can harm the embryo, and that frankly, from a cost-benefit standpoint, it's often not worth the money.
So at the end of the day, this PGT-A paradox is so much more than a technical debate. It's a collision between the cold, hard data of science and the incredibly powerful forces of culture, faith, and family. The proposed solution here isn't to ban the technology, but to arm patients with the unvarnished, uncomfortable truth. And this leaves all of us with a final crucial question. In this complex world we live in, when culture and science are on a collision course, is radical transparency the only ethical line we can draw?